On March 14, 1857, beneath the columned portico of the Richmond Exchange, a single human being sold for the equivalent of $378,000 in today's currency. The auctioneer's gavel fell 17 times before the final bid was accepted, and when it did, 3 men in the crowd collapsed where they stood. No record explains why this particular sale commanded a price that exceeded the cost of 12 experienced field hands, or why the buyer immediately transported his purchase 200 miles northwest into the Blue Ridge Mountains, never to be seen in civilized Virginia again. The Commonwealth's archives contain a single leather-bound ledger documenting the transaction, but 7 pages have been carefully razored out, leaving only the shadows of pressed ink bleeding through from the reverse side. What made one human life worth such an impossible sum? What secret justified a price that plantation owners whispered about in scandalized tones for decades afterward? Before we continue with the story of the Richmond Exchange and the sale that shattered every understanding of human commerce in the antebellum South, we need you to be part of this community. Subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell, because stories like this one, buried deliberately in the silence of history, deserve to be heard. And leave a comment telling us what state or city you're listening from. We want to know where our community of truth seekers is growing. Now, let us return to that March morning when something impossible walked onto the auction block. The sale that March morning would become a wound in Richmond's memory. But to understand why, you must first understand the city itself in those final years before the war. Richmond stood as the jewel of Virginia commerce in 1857, her tobacco warehouses lining the James River like monuments to prosperity. The city's tree-lined streets stretched between the Capitol building, designed by Jefferson himself, and the sprawling market districts where fortunes changed hands daily. Church bells marked the hours from a dozen steeples, calling the faithful to worship in a city that considered itself the most civilized jewel of the South. The Exchange itself occupied a Greek Revival building on Franklin Street, its Doric columns suggesting permanence and order in a world built on neither. The population of 38,000 souls divided themselves along predictable lines. The merchant class in their federal-style townhouse on Church Hill, the working poor in cramped quarters near Show Bottom, and the enslaved who outnumbered their owners but remained invisible in every civic calculation. Among the city's prominent families, the Havfields controlled the largest tobacco processing operations, while the Gresham brothers dominated the riverboat trade. But it was the auction houses that truly defined Richmond's economic character, processing more than 12,000 sales annually in a market that treated human beings as readily negotiable commodities. Thomas Fairmont operated the exchange with ruthless efficiency. At 43, he had conducted more than 6,000 sales, his practiced voice capable of extracting maximum value from every transaction. He kept meticulous records in leather-bound ledgers, documenting not just prices but peculiarities, distinguishing marks, skills, and the occasional notation that revealed more than any balance sheet. Defiant eyes, likely trouble, or read scripture. Dangerous. His office overlooked the auction floor, allowing him to observe the crowd's mood before each sale, adjusting his strategy accordingly. March 14th began unremarkably. The morning's first lots consisted of field hands from a bankrupt plantation in Goshen County, 7 men and 3 women who sold for predictable prices to predictable buyers. Fairmont moved through the transactions with mechanical precision, his voice rising and falling in the practiced cadence that signaled confidence to potential purchases. The crowd numbered perhaps 80 men, their faces familiar from 100 previous sales. Then, at precisely 11:47 by the exchange clock, everything changed. The crowd's murmur died when the side door opened and a figure emerged, accompanied by 2 men whose clothing marked them as having traveled considerable distance. Their boots carried mud from unpaved roads, and their coats bore the wear of rough country. But it was the third person who commanded every eye. She stood perhaps 5.5 feet tall, her posture rigidly erect despite the iron shackles connecting her wrists. Her skin bore the deep tan of outdoor labor, but her hands showed no calluses, no scars, none of the marks that typically accumulated on enslaved bodies subjected to plantation work. She wore a simple cotton dress, clean but unadorned, and her hair had been pulled back in a severe bun that revealed a face of unsettling composure. Her age appeared difficult to determine, somewhere between 25 and 35, but it was her eyes that caused the first whispers to ripple through the assembled buyers. They reflected no fear, no resignation, no emotion whatsoever. Fairmont descended from his platform, his expression betraying momentary confusion. He consulted briefly with the two escorts, examining papers they produced from worn leather cases. His lips moved silently as he read, and those closest to the exchange would later report that his face went pale, then flushed, then pale again. He looked up at the woman, then back at the documents, then up again with an expression suggesting he had misread something fundamental about reality itself. When he returned to his platform, his voice carried an uncertainty that veteran auction-goers had never heard before. "Gentlemen, we have before us today an unusual lot. The seller wishes to remain anonymous, as is their legal right under Virginia statute. The property before you has been designated Lot 37, no name provided, age estimated at 30 years, origin undisclosed, no documented history of fieldwork, house service, or skilled trade." A voice called out from the crowd, "What's her value then, Fairmont? Why waste our morning?" Fairmont's jaw tightened. "The opening bid has been set at $5,000. Silence crashed over the exchange like a physical force. $5,000 exceeded the annual income of most men present. It represented the cost of a prime breeding pair or 3 skilled blacksmiths or enough field hands to work 50 acres of tobacco. For a single woman with no documented skills or history, the price was absurd. "That's madness," someone shouted. "You've lost your sense, Fairmont." But Thomas Fairmont did not lower the price. Instead, he did something he had never done in 20 years of conducting sales. He opened the leather folder the escorts had provided and began to read aloud. The seller provides the following attestation. Sworn before a magistrate in Albemarle County on March 9th of this year. The property designated Lot 37 possesses knowledge of significant value to parties concerned with matters of agriculture, commerce, and territorial development. Said knowledge has been verified through demonstration to 3 independent witnesses whose signatures and seals appear below. The purchaser will receive, along with the bill of sale, a sealed letter containing specific instructions for extracting said knowledge. The seller guarantees the accuracy of all information obtained through proper application of these instructions. The crowd's confusion deepened into something approaching anger. Men began shouting questions simultaneously. What knowledge? What demonstration? What instructions? Fairmont raised his hand for silence, then continued reading, his voice growing quieter with each word. The seller further states that attempts to force disclosure through ordinary interrogation will prove futile. The property has been conditioned through methods both legal and effective to reveal information only under circumstances detailed in the sealed letter. The seller accepts no responsibility for consequences arising from improper handling of the property or failure to follow provided instructions. He looked up, his face grave. The opening bid remains $5,000. Do I hear $5,000? For a long moment no one spoke. Then from the back of the room, a hand rose. The man attached to it wore the plain clothes of a Western Virginia farmer, his face weathered by mountain winds. 5,000, he said simply. 5,500 came another voice, this one belonging to a Richmond merchant whose tobacco interest extended into 3 counties. What followed next would be discussed in hushed tones for years afterward. The bidding escalated with a speed that defied every convention of auction economics. 6,000, 7,000, 8,500. Men who had come to purchase field hands found themselves competing for something they could not name, driven by the guarantee of knowledge so valuable that someone would swear to its worth before a magistrate. The woman on the platform never moved, never spoke, her eyes fixed on some invisible point beyond the assembled crowd. At $12,000, only 4 bidders remained. At $15,002, the Western Virginia farmer and a man whose identity nobody present could determine, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, his voice calm despite the staggering sums he proposed. 16,000, said the farmer, his voice cracking. 20,000, replied the stranger without hesitation. The crowd gasped. $20,000 exceeded the value of most working plantations with land, buildings, livestock, and enslaved workers included. For a single human being, it represented a price beyond all reason. The farmer stood silent for a long moment, his face twisted with something between anger and despair. Then he turned and pushed his way through the crowd, disappearing into the March sunlight. The stranger stepped forward, producing from his code a bank draft that caused even Fairmont's experienced hands to tremble as he accepted it. The transaction took 43 minutes to complete. Legal documents were signed, witnessed, and sealed. The bank draft was verified by a courier dispatched to the Bank of Virginia on Main Street. And when everything had been formalized according to Commonwealth law, Thomas Fairmont handed the stranger 2 items, a bill of sale stamped with the exchange's official seal, and a sealed envelope bearing a wax impression of a symbol no one present could identify. The stranger took possession of his purchase without speaking a single additional word. He produced a key, unlocked her shackles with movement suggesting long practice, and gestured toward the side door. She walked beside him with the same unsettling composure she had maintained throughout the entire proceeding, and together they vanished into the Richmond streets. 3 days later, when inquiries began circulating about the identity of the buyer, investigators discovered that the bank draft had been drawn on an account belonging to a livestock company registered in Stone, a city more than 100 miles northwest in the Shenandoah Valley. The company's listed address corresponded to a grain warehouse that had stood empty for 7 years. The magistrate in Albemarle County, who had supposedly witnessed the seller's attestation, could not be located, though courthouse records confirmed his seal was genuine. The 3 independent witnesses mentioned in the sworn statement were never identified, and the woman who had sold for $20,000 was never seen in Richmond again. The sale's aftermath rippled through Richmond society like a stone dropped into still water. Within a week, Thomas Fairmont closed the exchange for 3 days, citing personal illness. When he reopened, he refused to discuss Lot 37 with anyone, redirecting all inquiries to his attorney, who provided only a terse statement confirming the sale's legality under Virginia statute. Fairmont's ledger entry for March 14th occupied a full page, unusual for his typically brief notations. But when a curious clerk attempted to examine it more closely, he discovered that 7 sequential pages had been removed with surgical precision, leaving only the faintest impression of text bleeding through from the reverse side of the remaining sheets. Rumors multiplied with the speed that characterizes scandalized communities. Some claimed the woman possessed knowledge of buried Confederate gold, though the war lay 4 years in the future and no one could explain how an enslaved person might obtain such information. Others whispered about stolen plantation account books, documents that could ruin prominent families if their contents became public. A tavern keeper near Shokow Bottom swore he had heard the woman speak in a language nobody recognized, though he could not explain how he had been close enough to hear her at all. The most persistent story involved the sealed letter. According to this version, passed from merchant to merchant in hushed conversations, the instructions detailed a specific ritual involving isolation, darkness, and questions posed in a particular order. The woman would answer only if these conditions were met exactly, and her responses would reveal locations of something valuable, perhaps mineral deposits or forgotten land surveys that could alter property boundaries worth thousands of dollars. Some claimed she was a surveyor's daughter who had memorized her father's secret maps before his death. Others insisted she had worked in a seagraver's office and stolen information about Western territories before Oklahoma and Kansas had been properly mapped. But the stories that gained the most traction involved the 3 men who had collapsed during the auction. 1. A tobacco factor named William Ducker recovered consciousness within minutes and departed the exchange without explanation. The second, a riverboat captain called Nathaniel Cross, required assistance to reach his home on Clay Street, where he locked himself in his study and refused visitors for a week. The third man, whose name no records preserved, was carried out by friends and never appeared in Richmond society again, though some claim to have seen him months later in Petersburg, his hair gone white and his hands shaking uncontrollably whenever someone mentioned the exchange. The most intriguing development came 6 weeks after the sale, when a Richmond Dispatch reporter named Charles Whitfield decided to investigate the transaction for a feature article. Whitfield was known for his tenacity and his ability to extract information from reluctant sources. He began by examining courthouse records in Albemarle County, searching for the magistrate's attestation. He found the seal impression in the record books, but the corresponding document had been filed in a section restricted to judicial review, inaccessible to public inquiry. When he pressed the court clerk for information, he received only a cold stare and a warning that some records remained sealed for good reason. Whitfield then traveled to Staunton, determined to locate the livestock company that had provided the bank draft. The warehouse at the registered address stood exactly as described, empty, its windows boarded, its door secured with a chain and padlock that showed fresh scratches suggesting recent opening. When Whitfield questioned neighboring business owners, he received contradictory accounts. One claimed the warehouse had been purchased by a land speculator from Lexington. Another insisted it belonged to a mining concern operating in the Western Mountains. A third refused to discuss it at all, turning away when Whitfield produced his reporter's credentials. The trail went cold until late July when Whitfield received an anonymous letter delivered to the dispatch offices. The envelope contained no return address, and the postmark indicated it had been sent from Westboro, a small town in Augusta County nestled against the Blue Ridge Mountains. The letter itself consisted of 3 sentences written in elegant script. The knowledge she carries could redraw maps. Some borders exist only in men's minds. Stop searching before you learn which category you occupy. Whitfield published a carefully worded article on August 3, 1857 titled, "The Mystery of the Richmond Exchange." He described the unusual sale, the astronomical price, and the sealed letter, but he drew no conclusions and named no names beyond those already public. The article appeared on page 7 of the Dispatch between advertisements for patent medicines and notices of estate sales. It generated modest local interest, but no significant response. 3 days after publication, Charles Whitfield failed to arrive at the Dispatch offices for his morning shift. His landlady reported that his room appeared undisturbed, his clothes and possessions untouched, but Whitfield himself had vanished. A police investigation produced no evidence of foul play. His bank account showed no unusual withdrawals. His friends and colleagues could offer no explanation. After 6 weeks, the investigation was quietly closed, and Charles Whitfield joined the growing list of people connected to Lot 37, who had simply ceased to exist in any verifiable way. The years that followed brought war to Virginia, transforming Richmond from a prosperous commercial center into the capital of the Confederacy. The Exchange building served as a military depot during the conflict, then stood abandoned during Reconstruction. Its auction floor silent, its records boxed and stored in a courthouse basement where they gathered dust alongside thousands of other documents deemed no longer relevant to a changed world. Thomas Fairmont died in 1869, his estate passing to a nephew who sold the Exchange building to a textile company. The nephew reported finding among his uncle's effects a locked iron box that Fairmont's will specifically instructed must be thrown into the James River unopened. The nephew complied, though he later admitted to friends that the box had been surprisingly heavy, as though filled with lead type or printing plates. But the story refused to die completely. In October 1873, a former Confederate officer named Daniel Vaughan published a memoir of his wartime experiences. Among the anecdotes about battles and campaigns, he included a curious passage about a conversation he had overheard in the winter of 1863 while recovering from wounds in a Richmond hospital. 2 elderly men had been discussing old times, and one mentioned the infamous Exchange sale of 1857. According to Vaughan's account, the man said the buyer knew exactly what he was purchasing. He had been searching for 3 years, traveling from Baltimore to Charleston, seeking someone with that particular knowledge. When he found her, price became irrelevant. He would have paid $50,000 if necessary. Some secrets are worth more than gold because they reveal where the gold is buried. The passage generated minimal interest when the memoir was published. Virginia was still recovering from war and Reconstruction, and few readers cared about mysterious auction sales from 16 years earlier. But Vaughan's words would resurface decades later when a historian researching antebellum commercial practices stumbled across them and began asking new questions about what knowledge could possibly justify such an impossible price. The historian's name was Margaret Holloway, and in 1891 she was already establishing a reputation as one of the few women willing to excavate uncomfortable truths about Virginia's past. Her interest in the Exchange sale began accidentally, triggered by a footnote in Daniel Vaughan's memoir while she researched economic patterns in pre-war Richmond. The mention of $20,000 caught her attention immediately. She knew enough about antebellum prices to recognize the sum as wildly aberrant, and her academic training had taught her that aberrations often concealed larger patterns. Holloway began her investigation in the Richmond courthouse, requesting access to the Exchange records transferred there during Reconstruction. The Clear initially resisted, explaining that the documents had been stored without proper cataloging and would require weeks to locate. But Holloway persisted, and eventually she found herself in a basement room surrounded by water-stained boxes containing the remnants of Richmond's commercial history. The ledgers were there, dozens of them, documenting thousands of transactions in Thomas Fairmont's precise handwriting. She found the March 14, 1857 entry immediately. The missing pages were obvious, their absence creating a gap in the sequential numbering. But Holloway noticed something the casual observer might miss: the impressions bleeding through from the reverse side of the remaining pages. By holding the ledger at specific angles under lamplight, she could discern fragments of text. Western survey marks, ridge line above seam follows 3 feet depth. The word suggested geological or geographical documentation, not the biographical details typically recorded for enslaved people being sold. Holloway spent 3 days attempting to decipher more using various lighting techniques and even a magnifying glass borrowed from a jeweler on Main Street. She managed to extract approximately 40 partial words across the 7 missing pages, enough to convince her that the removed entries described something related to land boundaries or possibly mineral deposits. Her next step took her to Stunton, following the same trail had pursued 34 years earlier. The warehouse had been demolished in 1885, replaced by a hardware store whose owner had no knowledge of previous occupants. But Holloway was more thorough than Whitfield. She examined property transfer records at the Augusta County Courthouse, tracing the warehouse's ownership backward through multiple transactions. The chain of title revealed a pattern. The building had changed hands 7 times between 1857 and 1885, each transfer occurring within months of the previous one, and each new owner listing an address in a different Virginia county. The final owner before demolition was recorded as a trust administered by an attorney in Charlottesville. But when Holloway attempted to locate this attorney, she discovered he had retired in 1887 and moved to Philadelphia, leaving no forwarding address. Dead ends accumulated. Every promising lead dissolved into confusion or silence. Holloway began to suspect deliberate obfuscation, a coordinated effort to erase any trail connecting back to the original transaction. But she possessed a researcher's stubbornness, and in November 1891, she experienced a breakthrough that would reshape her entire investigation. While examining tax records in Albemarle County, searching for any properties associated with the mysterious livestock company, Holloway discovered an unusual land transfer dated April 1857, 1 month after the exchange sale. A tract of 240 acres in the Blue Ridge Mountains near a place called Swift Run Gap had been purchased by a buyer listed only as J. Marlowe Agent. The price recorded was $12,000, a substantial sum for mountain land generally considered unsuitable for cultivation. More significantly, the property's legal description included a peculiar notation. Bounded on north by granite outcrop bearing survey mark 1749, on south by creek branch following limestone formation, on east by ridgeline above coal seam exposure. The geological specificity caught Holloway's attention immediately. Most land descriptions of the period relied on trees, streams, and other easily identifiable markers. This description suggested someone with detailed knowledge of the property's subsurface characteristics, the kind of knowledge that would require either geological survey or first-hand mining experience. Holloway traveled to Swift Run Gap in December 1891. A difficult journey requiring 2 train connections and a final stagecoach ride into mountain country that seemed untouched by the approaching 20th century. The property described in the tax records lay 3 mem from the nearest settlement, accessible only by a narrow track that wound through dense forest. She hired a local guide named Samuel Fletcher, a man in his 60s who had been born in these mountains and knew every hollow and ridge. Fletcher listened to Holloway's description of the property, then nodded slowly. "You mean the Marlowe place? Abandoned near 20 years now. Nobody goes there. Strange history to that land." When Holloway pressed him to elaborate, Fletcher's expression grew cautious. "My father worked a claim nearby back in the 50s. He remembered when Marlowe arrived with a woman, built a cabin up there, kept to themselves completely, stayed maybe 3 years. Then one spring they were just gone. Cabin stood empty until it fell to ruin. But there's more to it than that." He paused, clearly uncomfortable, continuing. Holloway waited, understanding that silence often extracted confessions better than questions. During those 3 years, Marlowe hired local men periodically, day labor, digging work mostly. "My father took one such job in 1858, said Marlowe paid well but insisted on strange conditions. The men worked in shifts, never more than 2 at a time, and Marlowe always had the woman present during the work. She would stand nearby, sometimes pointing, sometimes speaking quietly to Marlowe, guiding where they should dig. My father said they uncovered a coal seam quite substantial, exactly where she indicated. Later heard similar stories from other men who took Marlowe's employment. They would dig at spots she selected and always found something valuable. Iron ore deposits, limestone formations useful for building or underground springs that could power machinery." Holloway felt her pulse quicken. "Did your father ever speak with this woman directly?" Fletcher shook his head. Marlowe never permitted conversation with her. She communicated only with him, and he relayed any necessary instructions to the workers. But my father said she had eyes like someone looking through you at something beyond. And when she pointed to where digging should occur, men had learned not to question. She was never wrong. If you're finding this story as disturbing as we are, you're exactly the kind of person who belongs in this community. Hit that like button to help others discover this mystery and leave a comment with your thoughts about what knowledge this woman might have possessed. Was it genuine geological expertise or something else entirely? Share your theories below. Let's continue into the mountains where this impossible secret was finally put to use. The mountains where Lot 37 had vanished held more secrets than Margaret Holloway initially imagined. Fletcher agreed to guide Holloway to the abandoned property, though he insisted they make the journey in daylight and return before dark. The December afternoon was cold and clear as they climbed the narrow track, frost crackling under their boots. The forest had reclaimed much of the clearing where the cabin once stood, but remnants remained. A stone chimney rising from collapsed timbers, a well shaft carefully covered with fitted boards, and most intriguingly, a series of excavation sites scattered across the property, each one now overgrown, but still visible as depressions in the forest floor. Holloway counted 14 distinct dig sites, ranging from shallow test pits to one excavation that appeared to have descended at least 20 feet before being abandoned. At Fletcher's suggestion, they examined the well shaft first. When he lifted the covering boards, they discovered that the shaft had been sealed with clay and stones at a depth of approximately 8 feet. An unusual construction choice that suggested the well's purpose extended beyond water collection. "This is how Marlowe stored his ore samples," Fletcher explained. "Kept them cool and dry, protected from weather. My father mentioned it. Marlowe would bring up coal or iron ore from the dig sites, seal samples in canvas bags, and lower them into this shaft. Every few months he would extract them and transport them somewhere my father never knew where." Holloway knelt beside the shaft, examining the sealed interior. The clay showed marks of repeated opening and closing, suggesting frequent access over an extended period. But what struck her most forcefully was the precision of the excavation itself. The shaft descended straight and true, its walls carefully mortared with local stone, its construction suggesting engineering knowledge far beyond typical mountain building practices. They spent 2 hours exploring the property, examining each dig site in turn. A pattern emerged. The excavations followed a rough line running northeast to southwest, approximately parallel to the ridgeline, but offset by perhaps 300 feet. When Holloway plotted their positions on a hand-drawn map, the alignment became obvious. The dig sites traced the underground path of a geological formation, likely a coal seam or similar mineral deposit, with remarkable accuracy. As they prepared to depart, Fletcher pointed out one final detail. Near the collapsed cabin, barely visible beneath accumulated leaves and soil, a flat stone bore carved markings. A series of numbers and symbols that resembled surveying notations. Fletcher couldn't decipher them, but Holloway copied them carefully into her notebook, recognizing their potential significance. The return journey was conducted in thoughtful silence. When they reached the settlement where Fletcher lived, Holloway asked one final question. "Did anyone ever discover what happened to Marlowe and the woman, where they went when they left?" Fletcher's expression darkened. There was talk. Some said Marlowe sold his survey information to a mining company in Pittsburgh, made a fortune, and disappeared into the West. Others claimed he died up there in the mountains, and the woman simply walked away, vanishing back into whatever world she came from. But my father believed something different. He said that in the spring of 1860, he saw a woman matching her description boarding a train in Charlottesville, traveling alone, wearing fine clothes inappropriate for someone of her legal status. He didn't approach her, didn't alert authorities, just watched her disappear into a private car attached to a northbound train. He claimed she turned at the last moment before boarding, looked directly at him, though they stood 50 feet apart, and smiled. Not a friendly smile, he said. A smile of recognition, as though she knew he had worked on Marlowe's property and wanted him to understand something important. He never could explain what that something might be. Margaret Holloway returned to Richmond on December 19, 1891, her mind churning with implications she barely dared to articulate. The evidence she had gathered suggested something that challenged every assumption about the antebellum South social structure. An enslaved woman possessing sophisticated geological knowledge, valuable enough to command an astronomical price and accurate enough to locate mineral deposits with precision that seemed almost supernatural. But Holloway knew there was nothing supernatural about geological expertise. It could be learned, developed through experience or training, particularly by someone with access to survey records, mining operations, or scientific instruction. The question that haunted her was, how? How does an enslaved woman acquire such knowledge in a society designed to prevent education, restrict movement, and eliminate every possibility of advancement? Where does she learn to read geological formations, interpret survey marks, and predict subsurface mineral locations with enough accuracy to never be wrong? According to Fletcher's father's account, Holloway spent January and February of 1892 pursuing a new line of investigation. She examined records of geological surveys conducted in Virginia during the 1840s and early 1850s, searching for any mention of enslaved labor being used in survey parties. The Virginia Geological Survey, established in 1835, had employed numerous field teams to map the state's mineral resources, and Holloway knew that these teams often hired local labor, both free and enslaved, to assist with physical work, carrying equipment, digging test pits, processing ore samples. Her persistence yielded results. In a dusty archive room in the Virginia State Library, she discovered field journals from an 1847 survey expedition led by a geologist named William Barton Rogers, who would later become the founder of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Rogers' team had spent 6 months mapping coal deposits in the Blue Ridge region, and his detailed journals included periodic mentions of the workers who accompanied them. One entry dated July 23, 1847, stopped Holloway cold. Our expedition has been greatly aided by the addition of a Negro woman, property of Colonel Thaddeus Hargrove of Albemarle County, who has demonstrated unexpected facility for geological observation. While illiterate, she possesses remarkable visual memory and has proven capable of recognizing similar rock formations across widely separated sites. Colonel Hargrove hired her to our party for the nominal sum of $3 weekly, explaining that she had previously served in his household but showed aptitude for outdoor work. Her contributions have accelerated our mapping efforts substantially. Holloway cross-referenced the name Thaddeus Hargrove with property records, discovering that he had owned a plantation of moderate size near Charlottesville. He had died in 1853, and his estate inventory listed 18 enslaved people, but no individual names were recorded, only ages and general descriptions. There was no way to identify which, if any, of these individuals might have been the woman who assisted Rogers' survey team, but the connection was tantalizing. If Rogers' expedition had employed this woman for 6 months in 1847, she would have been exposed to systematic geological training, observing professional survey techniques, learning to recognize mineral deposits, understanding how subsurface formations could be predicted from surface indicators. A person with sufficient intelligence and memory could absorb enormous amounts of practical knowledge during such an experience, particularly if they understood that knowledge might someday represent their only path to freedom or value. Holloway began searching for other geological survey records, hoping to find additional mentions of the same individual. She discovered 2 more possible references: a brief notation in an 1848 survey report mentioning the Hargrove woman previously employed whose services would be valuable if available, and a letter from 1849 in which a surveyor requested permission to hire an enslaved woman with demonstrated geological aptitude for a Kentucky expedition. Though the letter provided no indication whether this request was granted, the pattern suggested something extraordinary: a woman who had somehow acquired valuable technical skills through circumstances that violated every social convention of her time, who had then been removed from plantation labor and employed in scientific work, accumulating knowledge that would eventually make her worth an impossible sum on the Richmond Exchange auction block. But new questions emerged, darker ones. If Colonel Hargrove had died in 1853, who owned the woman afterward? Who recognized her value and decided to bring her to Richmond for sale in 1857? And most troubling, who was the buyer who called himself J. Marlowe, who paid $20,000 and transported her to the mountains, where her knowledge could be exploited in complete isolation? Holloway's investigation took a disturbing turn in March 1892, when she received a letter from a source who insisted on remaining anonymous. The letter, postmarked from Baltimore, contained a single sheet of paper with a brief message written in educated handwriting. "You seek the woman from the exchange. I can tell you her name, but knowledge carries a price. Discontinue your investigation and I will reveal what you wish to know. Continue and you will discover why some secrets remained buried even after the war freed those who kept them." The letter included no address, no signature, no method for Holloway to respond. Its arrival demonstrated that someone was monitoring her research, tracking her movements, and becoming concerned about what she might uncover. A lesser researcher might have heeded the warning. Margaret Holloway was not lesser. She redoubled her efforts, focusing now on identifying J. Marlowe. The name itself was likely false, but the land purchase in April 1857 had required a legitimate signature and payment. She requested records of all banking transactions in Stunton during March and April 1857, hoping to find the source of the $12,000 used to purchase the mountain property. The request was denied. She attempted to access county tax records to identify who had paid property taxes on the Swift Run Gap land between 1857 and 1860. Those records, she was informed, had been destroyed in a courthouse fire during the war, though no other Augusta County records from that period showed fire damage. The obstacles multiplied. Every promising lead vanished into bureaucratic complexity or convenient destruction of documents. Holloway began to suspect coordinated resistance, but she could not identify who might be orchestrating it or why. Decades after the original events, anyone would care about suppressing information about a single enslaved woman who had demonstrated geological expertise. Then, in late April 1892, Holloway received a visitor at her Richmond boarding house. The man who called on her was elderly, perhaps 70, dressed in clothing that suggested former prosperity now faded. He introduced himself as Robert Denore, claimed to have information about the exchange sale, and insisted their conversation must remain completely confidential. When they were seated in the boarding house parlor, Denore spoke in a voice barely above a whisper. "I was there that March day in 1857. I bid on her, went to 5,000 before dropping out. Couldn't justify higher, but I knew what she was worth because I had seen her work." Holloway leaned forward, her heart racing. "You knew her before the sale?" Denore nodded. "I was a mining engineer in those days, working for a company surveying Western Virginia for coal and iron deposits. In the summer of 1856, we hired day labor from various plantations, needed men to dig test pits. One property owner sent a woman instead, said she was more valuable for our purposes than any field hand. We were skeptical, but the owner was insistent, so we took her for a week's trial." He paused, his expression suggesting he still struggled to believe what he was remembering. "Miss Holloway, I have worked with professional geologists from European universities. I have consulted with mining engineers trained at the best technical schools. That woman possessed more practical geological knowledge than any of them. She could read a landscape the way you or I read a newspaper, stand her on a ridge, let her observe the rock formations, the vegetation patterns, the way water drained, and she would tell you exactly what lay beneath the surface. Coal seams, iron ore, limestone formations suitable for quarrying. She was never wrong. Not once in that entire week did her predictions fail to match what we found when we dug." Holloway's mind raced. How did she communicate this knowledge? She couldn't read or write, or so we believed, though I had doubts about that. She would point and speak simply. "Dig here, 8 feet depth, you will find coal of good quality. Or this ridge continues south. Iron ore follows it, accessible at 20 feet. We would dig, and by God, there it would be. Exactly as she described." What happened after that week? Denore's expression darkened. "Our company wanted to hire her permanently, offered her owner substantial monthly payments. He refused. We pressed him, explained how valuable she could be, how much profit her knowledge could generate. He became angry, defensive, said we understood nothing about the situation. He ended the conversation and withdrew her from our employment immediately." But word spread among people in the mining industry. A woman with such abilities, if she could be acquired, would be worth a fortune. Several companies began making inquiries trying to identify who owned her, hoping to negotiate terms, and someone succeeded. Denore nodded slowly. Whoever brought her to Richmond for sale knew exactly what they possessed. That sealed letter Fairmont mentioned the instructions for extracting knowledge. That was a performance theater designed to drive up the price. The woman didn't need special rituals or darkness or any of that nonsense. You just had to take her to the land you wanted surveyed, let her observe and listen when she spoke. Simple as that. But by creating mystery, the seller generated competition, pushed the price to levels that made even experienced speculators lose their heads. Who was the seller? Denore shook his head. "I never discovered that. Tried for years, got nowhere. But I can tell you about the buyer. The man who called himself Marlowe was actually James Pritchard, a land speculator from Pennsylvania. He made his fortune buying mineral rights in undeveloped territories, then selling them to mining companies at substantial profit. He had been searching for geological expertise, some method to identify valuable land before competitors did. When he heard about the woman, he became obsessed. He would have paid $50,000 if necessary. $20,000 was a bargain for what she gave him, which was 3 years of surveying mountain properties in Virginia, Pennsylvania, and possibly Tennessee. Pritchard acquired mineral rights to dozens of tract CTs, all of which later proved to contain valuable coal or iron deposits. He sold those rights for amounts that made his initial $20,000 investment look trivial. Then, in 1860, he disappeared, took his fortune, and vanished just like the woman herself. Holloway asked the question that had haunted her for months. What was her name? Denore met her eyes. I never knew it. In that week we employed her. She never spoke her name, and her owner never provided it. She was just property after all, and property needs no name beyond what the owner chooses to assign. But I will tell you something I have told no one else in the 35 years since that March day. When the auction was concluded, when Pritchard took ownership and removed her shackles, she spoke just once before they departed. She looked back at the assembled crowd and said, "You have purchased knowledge, but knowledge requires payment beyond gold." Then she walked out beside Pritchard, and I never saw her again. But I have thought about those words every day since. Knowledge requires payment beyond gold. What did she mean? What payment was she exacting? And from whom? Margaret Holloway never published her research, the comprehensive article she had planned documenting the mystery of Lot 37 and the woman who possessed impossible knowledge remained unfinished in her files when she died in 1903. But her notes survived, archived eventually in the Virginia Historical Society, where they gathered dust for decades alongside thousands of other documents deemed too specialized or controversial for general interest. The truth about the woman's identity would not emerge until 1947, when a graduate student researching antebellum geological surveys for his dissertation stumbled across an obscure memoir published privately in 1871. The author was William Barton Rogers himself, the geologist who had led the 1847 Blue Ridge expedition. In this memoir, which circulated among only a handful of scientific colleagues, Rogers included a detailed appendix discussing enslaved labor's role in 19th-century American science. Among his observations, Rogers wrote candidly about the ethical complexities of employing enslaved people in scientific work. We exploited their labor while denying them education, yet occasionally we encountered individuals whose natural intellects surpassed our own. One such person was a woman we employed in 1847, property of Colonel Harge Grove. She possessed eidetic memory and spatial reasoning abilities I have encountered only rarely among trained scientists. When I attempted to discuss with Colonel Hargrove the possibility of purchasing this woman's freedom, intending to offer her formal geological training, he became violently angry and threatened legal action if I pursued the matter. He explained that she had been educated illicitly by his deceased wife, who had defied his orders and taught several enslaved women to read, write, and study from the Colonel's scientific library. When Colonel Hargrove discovered this transgression, he sold off the other women immediately, but retained this particular individual because her acquired knowledge made her too valuable to dispose of cheaply. Rogers continued, I learned later that after Colonel Hargrove's death, his estate executive attempted to profit from this woman's abilities by hiring her to various geological survey operations. The woman understood her peculiar position. Her knowledge made her valuable, but also made her dangerous, for educated enslaved people threatened the very foundation of the institution that held them captive. She apparently chose silence as protection, revealing her capabilities only when circumstances made concealment impossible or unprofitable. The memoir provided one additional crucial detail. I recorded this woman's given name as Anna, though I suspect this was a name imposed rather than chosen. She carried herself with dignity inappropriate for her legal status, and I detected in her expression of fierce intelligence that circumstances had forced into channels where it could never find full outlet. When our expedition concluded, she thanked me in Latin, flawlessly pronounced, then walked away before I could respond. That moment has haunted me for 24 years. We denied that woman everything, her freedom, her autonomy, her right to develop the intellectual gifts she possessed in such abundance. Yet she maintained her dignity and used the fragments of knowledge she had stolen or been given to create value where society said she had none. I do not know what became of her after Colonel Harrove's death, but I pray she found some measure of justice in a world designed to prevent it. The graduate student who discovered Rogers' memoir was named Thomas Edgerton, and he possessed the investigative instincts of a natural historian. He connected Rogers' account with the fragmentary records of the Richmond exchange sale, recognizing that Anna and Lot 37 were almost certainly the same person. He tracked down Margaret Holloway's archived research, discovered Robert Denore's account, and synthesized everything into a dissertation that would become, after publication in 1950, one of the most widely cited works on enslaved people's contributions to American scientific development. But Edgerton went further. He attempted to trace what happened to Anna after 1860 when Samuel Fletcher's father claimed to have seen her boarding a northbound train. The trail led through fragmentary records and persistent rumors, each piece adding detail to an extraordinary story of survival and calculated vengeance. According to documents Edgerton uncovered, a woman matching Anna's description appeared in Pittsburgh in late 1860, where she obtained employment with a mining equipment manufacturer. Her title was listed as technical consultant, an unprecedented position for a woman of any race in that era. She worked there for 3 years advising on mineral deposit identification and survey techniques, earning sufficient income to purchase her own freedom legally once wartime chaos made such transactions possible. By 1864, she had relocated to Philadelphia, where she established herself as a private geological consultant to mining companies and land speculators. What makes Anna's post-war career remarkable is not merely that she succeeded in a field dominated entirely by white men, but how she succeeded. Edgerton discovered correspondence suggesting that Anna maintained detailed records of everyone who had profited from her enslaved labor. The survey companies that hired her, the plantation owners who rented her expertise, the speculators who purchased her knowledge while denying her humanity. Once free, she systematically undermined many of these men's business interests by providing competing companies with superior geological intelligence, always at prices slightly lower than what her former exploiters charged. Several mining operations that had prospered using Anna's enslaved expertise collapsed into bankruptcy within 5 years of her emancipation, their downfall engineered with surgical precision by the woman whose knowledge they had stolen. The most devastating revenge involved James Pritchard, the man who had purchased her for $20,000 in 1857. Pritchard had built a mining empire on Anna's geological surveys, acquiring mineral rights across Appalachia. But in 1869, he made a crucial error. He attempted to hire Anna directly, apparently unaware that she was the same woman he had purchased and exploited years earlier. Anna accepted the employment, conducted a thorough survey of Pritchard's newest acquisition, a property in Pennsylvania's coal country, and provided him with a detailed report indicating vast coal deposits at accessible depths. Pritchard invested his entire fortune in developing the property based on Anna's survey. The coal deposits existed exactly where she indicated. But what Anna's report failed to mention was that the seams were contaminated with sulfur at levels that made the coal commercially worthless. By the time Pritchard discovered this, he had spent everything, and his creditors foreclosed on his mining empire. He died in poverty in 1874, having lost the fortune he built on the back of Anna's enslaved labor. Edgerton's research suggested Anna lived until at least 1892, possibly longer. She never married, maintained no permanent residence, and disappeared periodically for months at a time, presumably conducting survey work in remote locations. The last confirmed reference to her appears in an 1892 Philadelphia business directory, where she is listed as a Harrove geological consultant. The use of her former owner's surname, a bitter irony that may have been deliberate mockery of the man who had both educated and enslaved her. But perhaps the most extraordinary detail in Edgerton's account concerns the sealed letter, the mysterious instructions for extracting Anna's knowledge that Thomas Fairmont referenced during the 1857 auction. According to a source, Edgerton identified only as a descendant of the estate executive who sold Anna in Richmond. The sealed letter contained exactly 3 sentences. This woman possesses knowledge acquired through means that violated Virginia law. She will share that knowledge only if treated with respect and compensated fairly. Fail in either obligation, and you will find that knowledge can be a weapon more devastating than any physical force. The letter was not instructions for extracting knowledge. It was a warning that Anna herself had dictated, forcing her seller to include it as a condition of the auction. She had ensured that whoever purchased her understood exactly what they were buying. Not a passive repository of geological data, but a woman who knew her own value and would make her new owner pay for that knowledge in ways that extended far beyond the $20,000 purchase price. Thomas Edgerton's dissertation, The Geologist Who Could Not Be Free, Anna and the Economics of Enslaved Expertise, was published in 1950 by the University of Virginia Press. It sold modestly, attracting primarily academic readers interested in the intersection of slavery, science, and American economic development. The book received respectful reviews in historical journals, won no major awards, and gradually faded from prominence as newer scholarship emerged. But among a small community of researchers focusing on enslaved people's intellectual contributions to American development, Edgerton's work became foundational. It demonstrated conclusively that enslaved people had participated in scientific endeavors at levels previously unrecognized, that some had acquired sophisticated technical knowledge despite systematic efforts to prevent education, and that the intellectual property produced by enslaved labor had enriched countless white Americans who never acknowledged the source of their prosperity. Anna's story also raised uncomfortable questions about how knowledge itself can become a form of bondage. She had been educated against her owner's wishes, then found that education transformed her from a household servant into a commodity worth $20,000. Her knowledge gave her value, but not freedom. Even after emancipation, she remained trapped by circumstances, unable to claim credit openly for her geological expertise because doing so would reveal her former enslaved status and destroy her credibility in a white-dominated profession. She had to operate from the shadows, using her knowledge as a weapon against those who had exploited her because open acknowledgement would have invited either ridicule or violent suppression. The Richmond Exchange building, where Anna stood on that March morning in 1857, was demolished in 1953 to make way for a parking garage. No historical marker commemorates the location, and few Richmond residents today know that anything significant occurred there. The leather-bound ledgers documenting thousands of antebellum sales, including Lot 37, remain archived in the Virginia State Library, available to researchers by appointment but rarely examined. The 7 missing pages have never been recovered, and speculation continues about what information Thomas Fairmont considered necessary to destroy. Samuel Fletcher's family maintained their homestead in the Blue Ridge Mountains for 3 more generations before selling the property to a logging company in 1941. The abandoned cabin where Anna lived during her 3 years with James Pritchard has long since rotted away, leaving no trace beyond a slight depression in the forest floor and the sealed well shaft that occasionally confounds modern hikers who stumble across it. The 14 excavation sites she identified remain visible to trained eyes, each one marking a location where her impossible knowledge transformed worthless mountain land into valuable mineral deposits. Margaret Holloway's unfinished article about the exchange sale was discovered among her papers by a niece who donated them to the Virginia Historical Society in 1904. The niece attached a note explaining that Holloway had ceased working on the project abruptly in May 1892, offering no explanation beyond a brief statement that some stories resist conclusion because their meaning continues beyond any comfortable ending. Holloway spent her final decade researching other topics, producing several well-regarded articles about Virginia commercial history, but she never again investigated anything connected to enslaved labor or the Richmond auction houses. Robert Dunor, the mining engineer who had employed Anna briefly in 1856 and witnessed her sale the following year, died in 1901. His obituary in the Richmond Times-Dispatch made no mention of his involvement in mining or geological surveying, describing him instead as a retired merchant who had led a quiet, unremarkable life. But among his effects, his children discovered a locked box containing approximately 50 pages of handwritten notes dated between 1857 and 1900, documenting everything he remembered about Anna and the impossible knowledge she possessed. The notes included his own analysis of how she might have acquired such expertise, his theories about where she learned to read geological formations, and his growing conviction developed over decades of reflection that Anna's story represented something profound about American society, that intelligence and capability flourish regardless of circumstances, that knowledge cannot be permanently suppressed, and that those who exploit others' intellects without acknowledgement ultimately pay a price whether they recognize it or not. The final entry in Dunor's notes, dated 3 weeks before his death, contains a single question he posed but never answered. Did Anna truly possess supernatural abilities to read the earth? Or was she simply a brilliant woman who learned to exploit others' willingness to believe in mystery rather than acknowledge her humanity? That question remains unanswered, though modern geologists who have examined the sites where Anna conducted surveys confirm that her predictions about subsurface formations were remarkably accurate, consistent with professional-level expertise that would require years of training and practical experience. How an enslaved woman acquired such training in antebellum Virginia, where education of enslaved people was illegal and scientific instruction remained exclusively available to white men of means, continues to puzzle historians. Some suggest she had access to Colonel Harrove's library for years before he discovered his wife's transgression, absorbing geological texts and survey manuals through forbidden reading. Others propose that her work with William Barton Rogers and subsequent geological expeditions provided practical training that complemented theoretical knowledge gained elsewhere. A few researchers have suggested that Anna possessed genuine eidetic memory, allowing her to visualize and retain complex spatial relationships after a single observation, then apply that visual memory to predict what lay beneath the surface. Whatever the explanation, Anna's story demonstrates that intelligence and expertise can flourish under even the most oppressive circumstances, and that knowledge, once acquired, becomes a form of power that cannot be entirely controlled by those who believe they own the person possessing it. The woman who sold for an impossible price on a March morning in Richmond understood something her buyers never grasped. Knowledge requires payment beyond gold, and the debt always comes due eventually. The sites where Anna lived and worked remain scattered across Virginia, Pennsylvania, and possibly other states, unmarked and largely forgotten. The fortunes built on her geological surveys enriched dozens of families who never knew the source of their prosperity. The mining companies that profited from her enslaved expertise are long defunct, their records lost to time or deliberately destroyed. But somewhere in those mountains, in the patterns of excavation sites and sealed well shafts, in the missing pages of auction house ledgers and the fragmentary memoirs of men who witnessed something they could barely comprehend, Anna's story persists. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Anna's knowledge was truly learned, or did she possess abilities we still cannot explain? How should we remember people like Anna, whose contributions to American development went unacknowledged for decades, whose brilliance was exploited while their humanity was denied? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories of forgotten history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries that challenge our understanding of the past. The algorithm favors videos that get early engagement, so your like and comment in the first hour really help this story reach others who need to hear it. See you in the next video where we will continue exploring the dark corners of American history, where the impossible and the forgotten wait to be discovered. 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 Wait